I think we're in a position right now where a lot of the youth are looking for leadership, especially young black boys are looking for a lot of male mentors, a lot of male leadership in the community. And I will pose a question to both of you. What is the responsibility of the quote unquote, our scholars, our leaders in the community to the youth as far as being their mentors, as far as guiding them, and as far as empowering them into entrepreneurship or doing things outside of the typical model?
I think one of the biggest shortcomings of the modern day Afrocentric scholar, whom I would distinguish from those first two generations of African-centered scholars, I don't think the scholar we have today is of the same community commitment as a Dr. Ben or a Dr. Clark or a Chancellor Williams or a John G. Jackson. Those were, they were activists oriented. I think the average scholar today is capitalist oriented. Their research isn't really to change the conditions of the community, but simply to enrich themselves off of the information. So there's a big difference there, I think, in the way they operated 20, 30 years ago versus now. It's a commodity today. I think that ego is a very big problem now in the conscious community in general, but also amongst the African-centered scholars, where people just want to make the biggest name for themselves. And I can tell you, just in my own development, the insecurities that you can sometimes run up against in elders who are in a particular line of work because they're so used to being the one, being the big name. Sometimes their ego doesn't allow them to help bring the next generation along. In other words, if I waited for older psychologists who are considered scholars to bring me along, I would have never come along, because most of our scholars are so interested in just remaining the famous speaker or the most noted authority on a particular subject that they consider it a threat for anyone from the next generation to come up and quote unquote encroach upon their territory. And I see this across the board. For example, I always talk about how in the African American scholarly community, a lot of our presidents of organizations are well beyond the age of someone who should be a frontline soldier. As you see it with churches, we're the only people where the elders are still leading the movement. The elders are for guidance, for wisdom, for nurturance, but you cannot lead it because you don't have the charisma to bring people in. And the purpose of that person who's out front is to energize the movement and bring people in. And that's why Huey P. Newton was able to do what he did. Marcus Garvey was able to do what he did. Dr. Khaled, Malcolm X, Dr. King, most of them was in their 20s and 30s. That's even your 40s even, that's the time to really bring them in. But when you have 70 and 80-year-old people leading the charge, you can't galvanize the youth at that age. You're still very much important and critical, but not in that particular function. But I think, again, that ego says, I never want to get out the front seat. The ego, I don't ever want to have to relinquish this. And I think a lot of that comes from the castration that black men suffer in American society in general. I see the same thing when I go over to Europe. I see the same thing in Canada. I see the same thing in the Caribbean islands, where we're not allowed to be men in the truest sense of the word in the dominant society. So the only places where we can really exert our masculinity is at home and in our organizations, because those are the only places where we have some degree of freedom from the police state. And as a result of that, we try to overcompensate for all the times we wasn't allowed to be men by dictating in our community-based organizations. And that's why when you look at a lot of our organizations, whether they're integrationists or nationalists, most of them are ran by dictators. They don't have a democratic process. This is my organization. This is the way I run it. And if you don't like it, you can leave. And if you speak out too much against what I say, or if I consider you too much of a threat to what I'm doing, I'll just have you assassinated. And we've seen it happen as well. So we have to look at the castrated black male ego and how that's one of our greatest stumbling blocks to racial progress, which is why I often look at EGO as the European god of oppression that lives within a lot of black males. And until we deal with that, it's going to be hard to advance. I would just say that to say that I think there has to be internal reparations before there can be external reparations. We talk a lot about white supremacy, and we should. But if we don't do something about the white person living inside of us, we can defeat the one outside of us all day, and nothing would change because you haven't dealt with the one who lives inside of you. And I think until we change the way we think, it's going to be difficult to change any other aspect of our existence.
Phenomenal. Brother Ali?
Absolutely amazing. We can't assume. Let's not assume. It's just looking at President Barack Obama. he has to tell you who he is. We cannot be in a position to assume that just because someone comes in our color, it's like Halloween. We just had this holiday. Okay, so let that person's actions and word dictate who and what they are and what they stand for. Okay, so a politician is going to speak a word to get into political office, but they're not speaking from a seat of authenticity. There's no power, there's no passion there in regards to look at their track record of what they've been committed to and what they are focused on in regards to their community. Here's a person that won't even acknowledge who and what he is. Here's a person that won't go to any quote-unquote black events.
Right.
Here's a person that has facilitated what they wanted to project in front of us.
Right.
This is the new you. Okay, but we have to define ourselves. Each generation has a responsibility to define themselves.
Right.
Each generation has a responsibility to look at the ancestors, to get that knowledge and that wisdom, and then take action. Just as Dr. Umar was talking about, the leaders give that wisdom, they give that counsel, but we need the young soldiers to get out there and do the work.